This podcast is brought to you by the kind support of the Active Share podcast. What does a two-time world-winning coach and MLB baseball team owner, top chef, and luxury fashion designer have in common? They've all been featured on the Active Share podcast. If you're seeking the less obvious and are curious about the ever-changing world and how it affects investing, the Active Share podcast is for you. Hear thought-provoking conversations with thought leaders, company executives, and William Blair Investment Management's own analysts and portfolio managers as they share unique perspectives on investing in a world that's always evolving. Download the Active Share podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and TuneIn.
A wise man knows everything, and a shrewd man knows everybody. And you need to talk to people who are different than you, because they often have solutions, and you often have solutions. You have solutions to each other's problems. And often the reason someone beats you at something is because they know something that you don't.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Ryan Bailey, who is a partner and chief investment officer at Carbonado Partners LLC, a leading allocator and placement agent with a differentiated focus on emerging managers. He was previously head of investments at Children's Health in the Dallas area, and prior to that held various roles in investment boutiques, including placement firms. Welcome, Ryan. Thanks for joining me today.
Ethan, thank you for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Well, delighted to have you. And let's start where we always start, which is where you grew up, what you studied, and how you came to enter the world of investing in the first place.
So I had a somewhat of an untraditional background. So I grew up in a little township called Branchburg, New Jersey, a very small town. And then what I chose to study, or what I wound up studying in school, was economics in pre-med. But what I actually went to school for was electrical engineering and biomedical engineering. And I changed in the middle of it and got the investment bug. But prior to that, investing was a big part of my life and a big part of my childhood. I kind of just found myself in the world of investing when I used to sit with my parents and maybe we'd watch the news and they talk about, here's the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And I was like, well, what is that? And they got me a book on understanding Wall Street. And I read the book, and then I think I was my parents' nightmare, because then I said, okay, I'm ready to invest now. And I was like maybe 9 or 10 years of age, and took some of my money for my paper route and bought some stocks and did one that was really associated with telephones in Mexico. And the next thing I know, it paid for a good majority of my college education. So from there, I was always interested in investing.
That is extraordinary. Care to share the name of the stock? Is it one we would know?
Yeah, it's Telmex stock. So it wasn't a really thesis. It was a thesis really for a 9 or 10-year-old, but my family and I had gone to visit Mexico, and we saw all these people kind of standing outside at payphones. And this company was going to bring the phone inside the house. And I just kind of said, hey, I would really like that if that were me. And it wasn't really a major thesis, but I guess we timed it well.
As I said, truly amazing, prodigious talent at an early age. And taking that into university and beyond, how did you translate that talent into the investment professional role?
So really, I always thought of thinking outside of the box. And really, I boiled everything down to, hey, what makes something different? And what did everyone have to focus on? And to me, no matter whatever you were looking at, there always had to be an opportunity set, which I looked at as saying, okay, well, whatever this is going to do, what is it going to be used for? The next is you had to have an edge. You had to have some sort of advantage over everything else. And typically that's an informational advantage, or you had to be first or whatever. So these pieces came up to my investment style. And then the last thing I had to say is, what was the role it was going to play in your portfolio, which was something I developed later. But those are the three things that became the crux. But the first two were really developed at an early age. It's just kind of how I saw the world, is everything needed to have a great opportunity set, and they also had to have an edge.
And then you were an allocator for a number of years in a hospital setting. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you enjoyed about it and what was at the forefront of your mind at that time?
Sure. So why don't I talk a little bit first about why I loved investing? So I've always loved investing because it was a challenge. You were simply given like, here's $1 and you're told to grow it. And you got to take risks to do it, but you're not gambling. So when I came into a hospital, I came through and said, one of the main things you have to do as a hospital and as an allocator, CIO, you got to manage the risk of the institution and understand what its risk tolerance is. And you also had to align yourself with the mission of that hospital. And really what I saw, the mission of the hospital and the one I particular, Children's, a health system of Texas there in Dallas, was really making life better for children. And no matter what comes out of that hospital or whatever doctors need or whatever, no matter what good people are trying to do, without resources, it's very difficult. So if doctors don't have equipment, they don't have drugs, they don't have X, Y, Z, it's really hard for them to be helpful. So there was a huge amount of responsibility on your shoulders. But what I saw is saying, really, my job was to see how I could add value and help to try and grow those dollars. And I really boiled down to the world to what I always call is my ATMC, right? Asset allocation, tactical allocation, manager selection, and cost. And those are really your three ways that you could add value to what you could do and add value in that role. And my biggest one I've always focused on trying to get an edge, going back to my prior thinking, was on manager selection.
And what would be your response to the old adage that really it's asset allocation that really matters? If you say that your edge is a manager selection, how have you found that that adds value?
So I think asset allocation is a huge driver of returns, but your asset allocation a lot of times doesn't move around that much. I mean, you can change and use your tactical allocation and maybe move your asset allocation on the fringes. And if you hold it long enough, that could be considered maybe a change in the asset allocation. But your manager selection, especially in areas that were inefficient, or maybe in some of the private asset classes, added huge amount of value. And to me, that was really an advantage institutions had, because institutions were supposed to exist in perpetuity. So no time frame. So if you were able to select the right manager, especially in some of the private spaces or some of the hedge funds, the performance differential there was huge. So I did see that as one of the main ways of adding value. It doesn't mean that asset allocation isn't a big driver, but manager selection, I think, is something that each individual institution can add. And I like to think that hospitals actually had an advantage there, because sometimes the hard part isn't knowing who's good. Sometimes the hard part is getting access. And with some of the missions, like a mission of making life better for children, sometimes it's easier to gain that access.
And I'd love to hear your perspective on how a hospital allocation setting is different from perhaps other allocators, because we have had some hospital CIOs and investment committee members on this podcast before. What is the primary concern there? Is it around capital preservation, minimizing volatility? How do you think it differs, say, from a pension fund that might be focused on cash flow, or an endowment that might be really focused on peer returns and perhaps a lot of venture capital?
Yeah, so with a hospital, it's really around enterprise risk. And I always tell everyone that it's a very challenging job with a hospital, because you just don't have one pool of capital. So like a pension, the pension is the capital, but at a hospital, you can have a pension too. You can have an operating pool. You can have a foundation. You can have a captive for insurance. So it's all of these pieces that you have to manage. And it's really about managing the risk of the enterprise. Now, one of the nice things about a hospital is it's also a business and a non-for-profit structure. So you do get margin off and you do get new capital in. And where's the best and most efficient way for that capital to be placed? Like, should that capital be added to the pension? Should it go right into the foundation? How do these various pools work together? So really, it's enterprise risk. And one of the key things that you want to maintain at a hospital is your bond rating, because that gives you the flexibility to go to the capital markets if you need to. So if a new building or new project needs to be undertaken, that the opportunity is there and it's not too costly. And that's what you're often in the back of your mind is, how do I manage this capital appropriately? It's not as much of competitive, because unlike maybe universities where they all have the same mission and they look very similar, hospitals and how there's often a metric called days cash on hand. Those can vary significantly between the hospitals, and hospitals are in various situations. Their pensions could have different levels of funding. So it's challenging to compare the two and just say, well, my returns are better than yours. You're in one of those situations, well, it might be inappropriate to take certain levels of risk.
Really interesting distinction. Well, let's move now to the investment world as a whole. And I know you spend a lot of time at Carbonado and always have, in fact, spent a lot of time working with underrepresented or emerging managers. What are your thoughts on the way the industry is evolving in terms of barriers to entry? for these firms?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And where I've seen a lot of hope is if you look historically, it was really pensions that really just had this mandate of focusing on the underrepresented or emerging managers. And that was really because of their boards, that their boards would have some of the pensioners, whether you had the firefighters, whether you had teachers and so forth, that said, hey, this is important to us. And they would bring that to the pension investment committee or the pension board, and you would see something happen, whether it was an emerging manager program or something. Recently, after some of the events with George Floyd, you have seen some of the foundations, some of the healthcare, some of the endowments also say, hey, we don't have a lot of diversity in our portfolios either. And they want to change that. And you're often glad to see these other investors focusing on, hey, what can we do and so forth. But in terms of barriers, I still say they're still there. Like I still see a lack of diversity on the investment teams that make some of those decisions. Or if it's not there, you see a lack of diversity on the boards or the investment committees. So sometimes a lot of these emerging manager groups still lack an advocate inside the system to be helpful. Also, sometimes you see a certain number of dollars or percentage of the portfolio is cut out for these managers. And that's great, but it's also hard when these managers do well. It's hard for them to scale or graduate from some of those programs. People have tried the Rooney Rule. And just for clarification, that's a rule where they always include a diverse manager in every search. And the Rooney Rule was something they put in the NFL to make sure that there was a diverse coaching candidate or considered for coaching teams. The evidence has shown that that doesn't work, though, that people see a diverse manager, whether it's a woman or a person of color, and say, hey, they still don't wind up getting chosen because of that. You need to have multiple candidates to really benefit from the effect. Then I think the most challenging thing that I've come to learn is there's also a stigma with the identification. For a group to come forward and say, we're a minority woman business enterprise, we're MWBE. Sometimes they want to hide that, or they're told not to lead with that because there's a stigma that, okay, well, maybe it's not as good, or this is the only way you'll get into the portfolio versus I can't lead with it's the best idea. Really challenging. A lot of times you find it frustrating from the manager's perspective because the managers are often saying, well, if we're having this meeting in person or I was representing myself, you'd know that as soon as I walk through the door.
And I'd like to know also what the global focus on these issues are, because my sense is that this very much started in the US, as you mentioned, with public fund pensions. And now with the rising awareness of ESG everywhere, and I've also got a question about that coming up later, but do you see that these issues about the need for diversity, the importance of it, are going global?
No, it's not as big of a global push. If it gets any attention on the global side, it gets attention in the ESG focus. And people would consider it part of the S and the G as being good stewards. But it's really something more focused on the North America and particularly the US.
It is interesting, in the UK, there was recently a charter put together by a number, about 20 or so institutional investors, encouraging asset managers to sign up to the charter with a pledge to create more diversity. So I do think there's a little bit of contagion, or at least best practice being shared there, which is great. So hopefully we are on the cusp of some of that. Moving to just the industry in more general terms, in terms of strategies that excite you. You spend a lot of your time looking around the corner for the strategies that will be in demand in the future. What are you seeing right now that excites you in terms of product development?
Great question. So first, I'm seeing some things that we've seen before that are managers doing similar strategies, but the way they're leveraging technology and pattern recognition is differentiated. Like it's a greater edge. Like you're seeing groups, the way they're able to log information and canvas a larger scope, they get a much higher return on their time. Their knowledge of the risks they're taking. They're being more informed that, hey, there's a risk out there, whether it's a factor or something along those lines that we weren't aware that we were taking, but that was unintentional. They're able to adjust. And you're also seeing a piece, and it's really exciting, to do impact and focus on doing good. So they want to do well, but they also want to do good too. And you're seeing people also think about, if we make this investment, how can we have an impact? How can we change the world to be a better place? The other area that I'm seeing a lot of innovation and so forth is energy. The play between renewable and clean and traditional. To me, the ESG thing, it's great and it's really good for our society. It's good for our climate and so forth, but it does create a challenge. Like people hitting the brakes on someone investing in energy has created a great opportunity there as well. And the thought process is that these investments will compete against one another of the traditional energy versus the new energy. But our days of not using traditional energy, although are probably long, they're still decades and decades away. So you're seeing an interesting play between those two areas. And then you're also seeing a lot of innovation in the crypto and blockchain areas.
Having been, in terms of allocators, maybe somewhere close to the conservative end of the spectrum in the hospital plan space, what are your thoughts on how the crypto space will evolve in terms of suitability for institutional allocators? Have you given much time to that?
Yes. So I think allocators will probably invest around the picks and shovels around crypto. It's one thing to invest in the exchange. It's another thing to invest in the tools around it. I think you're less likely to see someone buying or making an investment in the currency itself. So that's where I see it going. That's where I see comfort level achieving. But you might start to see investors investing in hedge funds or whatever around it that might trade the crypto. But I don't see it as being really getting to the institutional level, at least in the near term, of where allocators will feel comfortable going to their boards or investment committees and making this decision.
And given you work with many managers at the sort of the prototype stage, maybe when they're thinking about their strategy or they're emerging, they're setting up, or you're perhaps providing advice as to how to position products. How about ESG? Is that now just, as I call it, a hygiene factor that every fund needs to note their strategy regarding ESG and be quite upfront about this with investors?
So to me, I see ESG as really two things. And there's one at the firm level and there's one at the fund level. So at the firm level, I think that what we're seeing is there isn't a real reason that they can't adopt that. There isn't a real reason why you can't take your firm and say, hey, let's focus on being good members of society. Let's have great governance and let's be good for the environment. That's totally within their control. Now, some of the investment strategies, it might be harder to implement, but they should at least think about it and should at least evaluate it. So before the ESG push, you didn't see people really going, oh, why do that? Now you're starting to see people at least conduct the analysis saying, is there a way I can incorporate it in my process and what would be the effects on returns?
Definitely the direction of travel that I also see. So I find that interesting. Let's talk now about diversity in the industry, because obviously you're focused a lot about the diverse managers and barriers to entry for them, as well as diversity initiatives at larger firms. If you were to take a step back now and look across the entire industry, the pipeline, the progression through it, diversity within senior roles, what would be the score that you would say the industry has, and what do you think it needs to do to improve that?
If you asked me a few years ago, it was failing. It's probably got a D now, so it's slightly better. But I can tell you from experience of diversity and kind of what does it look like. So I sat at numerous institutions and had billions of dollars behind me and would look at managers. And one of the key things I said was manager selection was one of the ways I would get my edge. And I took a lot of meetings and tried to do almost 3 meetings a day, 250 days in a year. So I saw about 750 managers a year going on past 16 years. I saw 7 people of color for managers. That can show you one. And I was lucky if I saw maybe 100 women during that time period. And what I'm seeing now, because of the focus, is you're starting to see more people start their own firms, more people giving it a try. The hard part is really kind of linking one of the points I made before of having the advocates, because when it comes to diversity and so forth, people have to realize they have to invest in potential. And that's hard to do. But even like some of the great investors, there was a time and point when some of the great investors that we know today had not managed capital before. And someone took a chance on them, someone advocated and invested in them, or someone gave them a chance. And that's a lot of times what people need. And people are trying, and you're starting to see some efforts there, but it's still not where it necessarily needs to be. Of people are still going, oh, well, where's your 10-year track record, or where's XYZ? People aren't going to have those. If we saw those out there, then we wouldn't have the diversity problem that we have.
It's really interesting, your focus on advocacy. I often like the phrase like people back people. So yes, if you can get a personal endorsement of somebody you know and trust that also knows and trusts this individual, that is the critical nexus. Obviously, there can be mistakes of judgment and someone can go awry in terms of how they perform. But I do think that personal connection is so key, which is why, as you said, stepping up as advocates is so important. But also, I wonder, as we now are, 2 years into our virtual existence, whether some of the strength of some of those personal relationships, especially ones that have been newly built, are what they could be. I think the answer maybe is no.
Yeah, well, it's often more challenging when you need to build the personal relationships and people can't meet. But one of the things that I did spend some time with was an individual named Jason Thompson. He and I did a call, and he's done a lot of research in this area. And he's put a book together on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what's so interesting is that he's been studying the topic for about 20 years before it was a topic that it is today. And a lot of the diversity that you see out there, or what we classify as diversity issues, aren't actually diversity issues. They're implicit bias issues. And what I mean by that, and there's a little test that is often done called the close your eyes test. And if you tell someone like, close your eyes, and a pilot walked in the room, and then you open your eyes and then go, what did the pilot look like? And people go, well, he was about X, Y, tall. I never told you that pilot was a man. I never told you the color of the pilot. But people have in their minds what they expect to see as an asset manager, investment manager, and they put that trust in. That's the part that's harder to change and make headway in. And the reason I give the industry a D today is because people are talking about it, and I think they're starting to make some progress in those areas.
Well, you're definitely preaching to the choir here, because as I mentioned earlier in our pre-chat, I do have probably majority women in these podcasts. And these are investors who are presenting a showcase of role models who are, I think, more representative of the world we live in than the industry we work in. So hopefully it's little gestures like that that will help us to chip away at some of that bias. So thank you for your helping with that. Let's go back to some of your personal reflections now. And you've spent time both in institutions as well as in startup situations. Were there any setbacks or challenges or even investment mistakes that you've learned from that you can share?
Sure. Let's see. I think one of my biggest setbacks in my life was, and I don't know how well known this is, but I was a survivor of the World Trade Center. So I was there that day and actually ran out of the way of the building falling. But after doing that, it left me saying life is a blessing. I never complain about getting older. I think about those people who weren't given the chance. And then I also walked away and said, enjoy life and have fun. And I try and figure out a way to laugh every day. In terms of challenges, I always tell myself, I remember things aren't going to be fair, but you can still win. And remind myself that when things are not fair, victory is even better. And the three things that you can always control are your attitude, effort, and preparation. And sometimes there's a piece of luck that happens with outcomes that isn't part of your thing. I think the biggest investment mistake that I made was earlier in my career was around mortgage-backed securities during the crisis. I'm trying to remember, but it was actually a very interesting story because it also framed how I invested. But we were looking at mortgage-backed securities and they were in the middle of a 10 standard deviation event. So we went in, we marched in, and what we learned was a 10 standard deviation event could turn into a 32 standard deviation event. And I always took from that is that remember, investing is like a school, much like life. And you must learn from your mistakes, and it's part of it, but assess what you did wrong. And next time you see that situation, look, is there an opportunity to play the other side next time? I'm trying to think, the other investment mistakes that I've made is this is a people business, and it's about reading people and understanding them. And you have to also understand that contracts cannot protect you from bad people. But I always like the saying, there's a little difference in people, but that difference is a huge difference, whether it's good or bad.
Some fantastic wisdom there. And I do like the focus on preparation, because I think in this industry, there's a lot of focus on prediction, expecting that new professionals who have a lot of experience will be able to predict the next year or the next 5 years. And I don't think we have that ability, but I do think preparing for it will certainly ensure that we're going to be in a better place no matter what happens. So thank you for that. Looking at some of the key people who influenced you in your career or life, was there anyone that you can mention?
This is a great question, because when you think about that, you don't want to leave anyone out. At the same time, there are people who have been extremely impactful for me and that I can sometimes still hear their voices and what I took from them. But one of those key people was my grandmother. She passed away a couple of years ago, but she lived to the age of 99. But one of the things that always inspired me about her was her ability to tell a story. She says that they didn't have television, they didn't have radios at certain points in her life. So what you had to do is entertain, and the way people would learn is they'd tell stories. And she was able to tell me tremendous stories that sometimes I remind myself of and help keep you motivated. And I remember stories about how tough things were for her, and it would sometimes motivate me to this day. Like she told me a lot of stories about my grandfather. He was a Tuskegee Airman, and some of the challenges he went through. So you sometimes feel like you're not alone. My parents have been hugely influential, just looking at through what they did and how they struggled and all these sacrifices that people made for where you are and your existence, and then the things you'll do for your children. I also am very grateful to all of the people in my career who've given me a chance when I didn't have that track record, who gave me an opportunity. I think that's one of the greatest things that you can do for someone and have an influence on their life, is just have some confidence in them. And what people don't realize is that sometimes people need you to believe in them before they can believe in themselves.
There's some wonderful recollections there. And you've already laced all of our discussion here with lots of words of wisdom, from the ATMC focus in the investment world to the importance of attitude and preparation. Is there maybe one piece of advice that any of these mentors and inspiring people in your life shared with you that you still carry with you now?
Yeah. So I think one of the things was, it was a very simple phrase, but they said that I would often because I would think that I could just study and get a lot of things done, and that you could read, and kind of into that preparation is I can try and know more than everyone else. So I would read everything I could get my hands on. I would try and study investing, because investing to me was not something that you could 100% learn from books. Like, it was an apprenticeship program. You had to have experience around markets. You had to have that of being in the situation and dealing with the emotions around them and so forth. But one individual told me, a wise man knows everything and a shrewd man knows everybody. And you need to talk to people who are different than you, because they often have solutions, and you often have solutions. You have solutions to each other's problems. And often the reason someone beats you at something is because they know something that you don't. So that piece of wisdom of not just trying to know everything that's in the books or reading everything, but also getting out there and talking to people and networking to say, maybe I don't have the answer, but I can go find someone who's dealt with this, or being connected to someone. And sometimes that's what gets you the chance, or gets you the opportunity, is you have other people out there who you know and can put you in good situations or tell you about something. So there's a way to get an informational advantage just from knowing other people.
Yeah, well, that's certainly, that importance of networking is certainly a theme that's come up time and time again. And it is often so much overlooked, I think, in every generation. But thanks for sharing that. And my last question is, what advice you would have for your younger self? Looking back now to that, not as back maybe as far as the 10-year-old, since you didn't seem to need much advice back at that age, but maybe at the college years. Anything that you know now that you wish you had known then?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I remember worrying when I was graduating from high school, am I actually going to get into a college? You're so scared that you're not going to achieve and so forth. And here's what you're going to be. You're told that you need to decide what you're going to do. You're going to be this major and get to this next point. When I think in my advice now, as gotten older, is you learn to enjoy the journey. You may not know where you'll end up, but that's kind of part of the fun. I'm not sure if I would have thought way back then that I would be doing what I'm doing now, but I'm enjoying myself. And sometimes it's the best story to tell, is how kind of you weave through all of these various situations and get there. I don't know if you have a destiny or not, but I would tell someone to enjoy the journey, even though if they might not know where they'll end up, but things are going to be okay.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you and learn a lot that I hadn't known about you before. My overall takeaway is that I'm delighted to be able to amplify some of the good that you're doing, because I truly feel that our industry is a better place for having you in it. And thank you for all the wisdom you shared here and for sharing your insights with us.
Ethan, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
I'm Ethan Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.